Well, hello, and welcome to another edition of Tea Time Chat with your host, Ryan, here at my lovely Victorian lair here at Cthulhu Cottage. And today we are going to do another round of Earl Grey with the usual cream and sugar. Now, I don't want to get off topic too much, but living out here where I live, I don't have a lot of options for tea without driving into the next town. So really, I have to drive into the next town north of here to the Walmart there before I really have any decent selection. And I haven't really so much wanted to make a special trip up there for that purpose. So for now, I'm somewhat limited. I have this box of Earl Grey, which I normally get decaf, and I messed up this time. I have some constant comment, and I have a few herbals. So anyway, we're not here to talk about tea. We're here to talk about music and various things related to music and playing guitar. And today what I'd like to talk about is music theory and how that relates to guitar and learning songs and kind of my history of experiences with music theory. Including, of course, learning musical notation. So I talked kind of about my history of learning guitar before, so I don't want to go into that too much again. But I didn't get a lot of theory when I was taking lessons. As I said, started off trying to learn classical guitar. Along with that was musical notation. And then went on to learn the scales. Remember the guy taught me the E major, G minor, sorry, it was the other way around, G major, E minor scale. And he also tried to teach me modes, and I didn't really figure that out. And again, I was in middle school at this time, and music theory was a little bit frightening to me. It seemed, what I was trying to learn of it was seemed to be very complex to me at the time, and it was really quite scary, and that unfortunately colored my experience. And I was somewhat hesitant to learning music theory for quite a long time. I tried to avoid it, and I know that's rather unfortunate. And what's also unfortunate is that guitar is an instrument that you can really learn to play, and learn to play fairly well without really knowing what you're doing musically. And I don't know if there are other instruments that are like that, but yeah, I mean, if you want to play guitar, you can just get by just learning the chords. If you learn all of your basic chords, major, minor, even your seventh chords and your power chords, you can play pretty much any contemporary song, like on the radio or otherwise, that you want. And you don't necessarily have to know anything about keys, excuse me, or chord scales, or anything like that. I mean, you can just look up the songs online and you can say, okay, yep, these are the chords, and you can play it. And even if you are interested in, lead guitar or whatever, you can look up the tabs online and say, okay, I put this finger here and this finger here on these frets, and you can learn an entire solo note for note without having the foggiest idea of what scale you're playing in or anything like that, really. Which I don't really recommend that, but you can certainly do it. I think there are lots of kids out there that do exactly that, and they do these covers of songs, whether it's a real song or whether it's a cover of Nintendo. And I'm not not trying to slam the Nintendo guys, because they're good guitarists. I just have to wonder how many of them have actually taken the time to learn their different scales and things, and how many of them are just looking up tabs online and just, learning that. Anyway, so yes, the point I'm trying to make here is you can actually be a quote-unquote good guitarist without really knowing what you're doing musically, and I don't think that's a good thing. So, I was very resistant to learning music theory for most of the history of playing guitar, and it definitely hurt. If you're trying to write songs, it really helps to know some theory, so you know what chords go together in a key, and you're not going all over the place. And again, I guess that's a matter of opinion. If you can put chords together that aren't necessarily in a key, like if you wanted to do C, F, G, D major, which D major would not be in the key of C major, and if you feel like it sounds good, then really who is anyone to tell you otherwise? If it's your song, you're having a good time and you like it, really who's to say you can't do that? And so I think a lot of my songs back in the day that I wrote were somewhat out all over the place musically. There were a few instances where I got lucky and the song was clearly in E minor or whatnot. So I have to wonder how many other people in the world of guitar do that same thing. They just kind of ignore theory. And I guess if you can play something decently by ear, then great. Just put it together, and if it sounds okay, that's fine. If it comes to soloing, though, that can get a little dodgy. If you've got chords from all these different keys, and here you are trying to play a solo over it, you might not get the best musical results. I tried doing that before. And most of my songs back in the day were just power chords. So in case you don't know, a power chord is just like the root of the chord and the fifth of the chord and the octave. And as we know now from studying music theory, what makes a chord major or minor is the third. So you have the root, third, and fifth. And if you flat the third, that becomes minor. So in our instance of D major, you've got D is the root. I believe A is going to be your fifth. And F sharp would be your third. So a D minor, which would be in the key of C, D minor would have that F sharp flatted to an F. So D minor, because it has no flats or sharps, that's in the key of C. Anyway, so yeah, the more complicated kind of music that you want to, and this is really, again, if you're trying to create your own songs, the more complicated music that you're trying to write, I think it becomes more and more important to learn theory, learn your scales, and if you're going to be a lead guitarist, you definitely want to learn your scales. Now again, I pretty much only knew that E minor, G major scale. And I remember I talked about before, the guy didn't teach me that you can play in other keys by just moving that pattern up and down the neck. So pretty much, if I had a song, whatever chords it was, I was using that scale, right or wrong. And in some cases it worked out. In some cases, like I said, the song was in E minor and the scale worked out. And in one case, the song was in A minor, and I played that same scale, which worked out because it ended up being kind of like a Dorian thing. I think. We'll get to the modes in a minute. But anyway, so my point is, don't be one of those people that is just painting by numbers. Don't use tab and trying to learn all these songs and just put your fingers here and not know what you're doing. That's kind of disgraceful. if you're just out there to have a good time and that's what makes you happy, by all means. But if you have an interest in being like a serious musician, don't do that. Which that brings me to my next point, is guitar tab. And a lot of people, a lot of quote-unquote serious musicians really hate tab. And as I have kind of moved along in my musical journey and learned more, I definitely have started looking down on it a little more myself. Like, you know, trying to learn a song or whatever. Like, there was a few things I tried to learn. Like, I remember trying to learn the title theme from Zelda 2. And here you've got the tab, which you can find online. So I remember downloading, and by tab, we're talking about Tablature, which has 6 lines, 1 for each line of the guitar. Instead of notes, there are numbers that correspond to frets on the guitar. So, you know, instead of like having a G, if you want to play the G note on the D string of your guitar at the 12th fret, you would have the 3rd line and you put a 12 there on it. And again, all you have to know to do that is just 12th fret G string. You don't have to know what that note is, like, which I don't have a guitar in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that would be the G note because it's, you know, an octave above the open string. So you would have G, then next step up would be A. So you don't have to know that to play tab. So it really, I mean, you can learn this solo note for note and have no idea like what notes you're playing at all. And I guess that's why people look down on it. And again, trying to learn this theme of Zelda 2, I had since taken that video down. But lately, I have, well, not lately, but excuse me, last times I was looking at tab, trying to learn something note for note, and it becomes kind of hard because my brain thinks of it as just numbers, and it was hard for me to kind of get into the musical context, like say, oh, well, this is okay, for instance, like I tried to learn the solo note for note to We're Not Gonna Take It. And then clearly that song is in E major. So, you know, you do your tab here, and then it's not necessarily clear to you unless you can put it together and say, oh, this is E major scale we're using. Whereas with musical notation, you know immediately. You know, you've got the key signature up there, which tells you how many sharps or flats, and you either know it off the top of your head or you look it up using the circle of fifths, and you say, oh, okay, this is clearly, not necessarily clearly, like in Fure Elise, it was no sharps, no flats, so that could have been C major, or, excuse me, yeah, that's right, C major or A minor. So you have to at least do a little bit of detective work, and by analyzing the notes, you figure out which notes you're emphasizing, and I was able to determine, yeah, this is okay, this is A minor. You know, as you're hitting that A, that's your root note. So that brings me to another point. When you come to these jam tracks online that say, this jam track is in the key of E minor G major. Well, no, it's not. Not unless the song actually modulates. Like, depending on which chords you're using, that's kind of the key of the song. Yeah, the scale notes are the same between your major and your relative minor. They're the same notes. But if you're in G major, you're going to be emphasizing the G side. Like if your chord progression is G, C, D, well, you're going to be emphasizing the notes of G, and D would be the fifth of G, I guess. So you're going to be emphasizing the notes and the chord tones of G major, C major, and D major if you're playing in D, you know, if your song is in G major. Whereas if your song is in E minor, and your chords are E minor, A minor, B minor, then you're going to be emphasizing those notes, hopefully, when your chord tones, as they say, when you're playing your solo. So no, it's not like it's in both, unless again it actually modulates. So you emphasize certain chords. I mean, and I don't think most jam tracks do that, but anyways, that brings me to the next point. So we talked about that. So when you're actually learning your scale shapes, so kind of once I figured out that I could move the scales up and down the neck, to the little target positions to play in whatever key, really the next step is to learn the notes on your guitar, because you can't target notes, you can't target those chord tones unless you know all the notes on your guitar. So that's another thing. I guess maybe whoever's posting these jam tracks hasn't gotten there yet, or whatever. And there was one jam track that was, I forget what key it was in, maybe it was in G major or whatever. But they posted like every alternate name for that scale. They're like, try all these scales, and it was like G major, E minor, and whatever the modes of that worked out to be. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they went through everything that was the same, that same scale pattern, just every different name. I'm like, really? They're trying to be musical smartasses, I guess. Anyway, so talked about scales and everything, and modes, I guess, is a good topic next. I look at modes as just variations of a given scale. So, and I know it's like you start the scale on a certain degree, like the second mode you would start on the second scale degree and go up from there. There's some confusing ways to explain it, but basically if you think, okay, if you're in A minor, your Aeolian mode is the A natural minor scale. And you can have different flavors of that. Like if you want to play an A Dorian, which I think A Dorian maps out to be the E minor G major scale, actually. So if you want to play an A Dorian, you're just using like an alternate form of that, and you just have to know, okay, slide your fingers here, start the scale pattern, and voila, you're in Dorian. Of course, if you know your notes, even though you're playing the G major E minor scale, you're still targeting those same notes. Of course, then, well, how do you use Dorian? Like, I think technically speaking, if you're in a progression, it's power chords. I think you can use Dorian anytime where it's not really major or minor. Remember, we talked about power chords. So if you're doing like A minor, or A power chord, D power chord, E power chord, like doing blues, then you can play Dorian, because it's kind of a blend of major and minor scales. And all you really need to know is you just slide your fingers up, start the scale at a certain position on a certain fret, and there's your Dorian. Doesn't matter what key, you just figure out where to slide the scale, and then you go. You just keep in mind what notes you're trying to emphasize. I don't use modes a whole lot. I mean, Dorian is easy to use. You've got your minor modes and your major modes. So Dorian, Phrygian is cool. It's another minor mode. I don't play around with that too much. I'm trying to do that though. Anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked too much into modes, but again, just we talked about modes, and just think of them as kind of like a different flavor of the scale. So if you're in a minor key, you've got a minor chord progression, and you don't want to just play the natural minor, try and figure out what kind of mode you could play. Maybe you could play Dorian, maybe you could play Phrygian, which is supposed to be kind of a darker, sound. So just think about that. I mean, so you've got Aeolian, Dorian, Phrygian are your minor modes, and then your major modes, you've got Ionian, which is your major, you've got Lydian, and Mixolydian. So it's, you know, if I'm just playing around to jam tracks or whatever, it's good to try and put those in as maybe a flavor. I'm not going to try to pretend to be an expert in when to use these modes or whatever, but anyway, we're getting, this video is already 20 minutes long. We'll go till we run out of tea. So we talked about scales and modes. Let's talk about the Nashville Numbering System. And this is something that really used to irritate me back in the days when I was sort of willfully, and there is the last of the tea. So we'll close with the Nashville Numbering System. But yeah, this used to really irritate me back in my days of willful ignorance of music theory. And it's basically, it's the numbers or Roman numerals. Like if you see a chord progression stated as 1, 4, 5, if it's capital Roman numerals, you know that's major. If it's lowercase Roman numerals, you know the chords are minor. So whenever I was around someone who knew that, and they would say, okay, this chord progression is 1, 4, 5 or 1, 6, 4, 5, or that would just bug the snot out of me because I felt like they were being musical elitist, which they may or may have been at that point. So why don't you just say what the chords are? You know, tell me what those chords are. In some cases, I guess you just can do that. But the whole point of the Nashville Numbering System is it's a formula. So you've got all these keys and all these chord scales. So 1, 4, and 5, that's like the root chord out of the chord scale. So if you're in G major, it's a G major chord. 4 is like the fourth chord in that scale, which in the case of G major would be C major, and D would be the fifth chord, and like your fourth is like the subtonic, and then your fifth is like the tonic, and supposedly, according to theory, the transition between the 5 chord and the 1 chord is a really strong transition. So you talk about, like, you know, you have tension, and that's what makes it sound good. Like you're hitting the 5 chord, which builds your tension, and as you go back to your root, you know, that's supposed to release the tension or whatever and make it sound good. So lots of songs use that pattern, and that's what the Nashville Numbering System is. It's just telling you the pattern. So if you want to play that GCD pattern in other keys, you know, the Nashville Numbering System's how to do that. So you say 1, 4, 5. So if you're in G major, you know that's G major, C major, D major. If you're in E major, that becomes E major, A major, B major, and so on and so forth. So that it does really have a purpose, and it is useful, although it is very confusing if you don't know what is going on there. And I think maybe that is some consternation to people that don't know theory, don't know your chord scales and things like that. And I think it's definitely helpful, because if you start to learn your different standard chord progressions and you learn how they sound, it does help you to pick out a song by ear. And I am by no means an expert in playing by ear, but if you start to know what these chord progressions sound like, you can say, oh, well, that's obviously a 1, 4, 5 progression, and then you figure out, if you can figure out the key it's in, then you kind of know the song. Or if it's 1, 6, 4, 5 is a very common progression for things like doo-wop or whatever, or 1, 6, 7 is kind of a darker sounding progression used, for a lot of rock and metal. So if you can figure that out, then it does help you. Knowing your chord scales, knowing your progressions, does help you to kind of pick songs out by ear, and that's something I'm still growing and working on. and I hope to get better at. And I know a lot of the music I listen to with like a lot of heavy distortion, that can make playing by ear, I think, a little more difficult to pick out those chords and pick out what they are. But anyway, there's a lot more I could talk about in terms of music theory, but we're already at 25 minutes, so I'm going to say that the cup's empty now, and it's time to stop. I'll be posting probably a backing track tonight from the last project I did, the reggae project, and then I'll probably start working on another cover song tonight and post that next week. So please subscribe, check back here for updates, and hopefully we'll see you next week.